The chocolate wrapper crinkled in the American soldier's hands. April 1945. Munich lay in ruins around them. 8-year-old Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against a shattered window. Her eyes grew wide. Inside that simple cardboard box lay treasures she had forgotten existed. Real chocolate, actual coffee, meat that came from cans, cigarettes wrapped in clean paper. The young GI noticed her staring. He walked over. One piece of chocolate changed everything. Tears streamed down her thin cheeks. 2 years had passed since she had tasted sweetness like this. This single moment would echo across thousands of similar encounters throughout occupied Germany. Each one revealed the same shocking truth. 2 worlds had collided. American abundance met German starvation. Victor faced vanquished. The gap between them seemed impossible to bridge. But first, we need to understand how these worlds had become so different. German civilians had endured rationing since 1939. What began as minor inconveniences had transformed into desperate survival. Spring 1945 brought rations of barely 1,000 calories daily. Some areas received only 1,250 calories. Nutritionists today would classify this as starvation level. Meanwhile, American soldiers carried K-rations containing nearly 3,000 calories per day, more than double what German families received. These compact boxes had been designed for paratroopers, lightweight meals that fit in pockets. Now they symbolized American industrial might. The German rationing system had worked efficiently in earlier war years. Reich Food Minister Herbert Bacher had orchestrated the theft of food from occupied territories. The infamous Hunger Plan deliberately starved Soviet civilians to death. Their food went to Germany instead. By 1944, even these brutal policies couldn't hide reality. Germany was losing the logistics war as much as the battlefield war. German families learned to make coffee from chicory. Roasted acorns became a substitute. Ground beech nuts replaced real coffee beans. Bread contained sawdust and mysterious fillers. Meat had vanished from most tables. Children grew up never knowing chocolate's taste. Fresh fruit became a distant memory. The black market thrived, but ordinary citizens couldn't afford the prices. A single egg cost several days' wages. Into this world of deprivation walked American soldiers. Their rations seemed like treasure chests. Each K-ration contained basic meat and biscuits, but also luxuries Germans hadn't seen in years. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, instant coffee, canned fruit. The C rations impressed even more. Multiple varieties of canned meats, vegetables that still had color, sweets that hadn't been rationed or substituted. But here's where the story becomes complicated. American soldiers received strict orders. No fraternization with German civilians. No sharing of rations. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had issued clear directives. Contact with Germans was forbidden. Military planners had practical concerns. Feeding German civilians would strain supply lines. Political worries ran deeper. American public opinion might not support helping former enemies. Military records show these orders were crystal clear. American military wives who arrived later received similar instructions. Leftover food should be destroyed. Never allow German maids to eat it. Food should be made inedible rather than shared. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. Deep suspicion and anger toward Germany remained strong. The war had just ended. Memories of American casualties were fresh. Yet human nature proved stronger than military orders. German children begging for food touched even battle-hardened veterans' hearts, especially when they begged for candy and chocolate. Even experienced soldiers found it impossible to turn away completely. Private Richard Mullen served with the Third Army. His diary recorded the difficulty of not smiling at German children. Their innocence seemed to rise above war's hatred and anger. The official policy felt increasingly hollow. Children created the first significant breaks in the non-fraternization policy. June 1945 brought General Dwight Eisenhower's official lifting of the ban on speaking with German children. The following month permitted conversation with German adults in public places. But even before these official changes occurred, many soldiers had quietly shared their rations with hungry German families. Staff Sergeant Tom Patterson of the 82nd Airborne recalled German children gathering around American soldiers during mealtimes. They didn't beg aggressively. They simply watched with wide eyes as Americans opened their rations. The contrast disturbed many soldiers. It felt wrong to eat in front of obviously malnourished children without offering to share. American K-rations would have seemed like feasts to most German civilians. The breakfast unit contained ham and eggs, fruit bars, coffee, sugar, 4 cigarettes, chewing gum, even toilet paper. The dinner unit had cheese or meat spreads, biscuits, sugar tablets, lemon powder, more cigarettes. The supper unit included canned meat or pork, chocolate, hard candy, bouillon powder, and cigarettes. Each complete ration weighed just over 2 pounds, but it contained more nutritional value than most Germans saw in an entire week. German civilians witnessing American soldiers eating were often stunned into silence. Frau Ann Weber was a housewife from Frankfurt. She later described watching American soldiers casually discard cigarettes. Those cigarettes would have been worth fortunes on the black market. She couldn't understand such waste of precious commodities. What Americans saw as routine military rations, Germans saw as unimaginable luxury. The cultural shock worked both ways, though. American soldiers had entered Germany expecting to find devoted Nazi populations. Instead, they found ordinary people struggling to survive. Many GIs were surprised by German civilians' apparent friendliness. They were puzzled by the curious absence of anyone willing to admit supporting Hitler. They encountered well-dressed civilians living in homes containing modern furniture. Paintings hung on walls. Other signs of former prosperity remained visible. Yet these same people were clearly malnourished and desperate for basic necessities. Private Richard Kingsbury of the 94th Infantry Division remembered being struck by contrasts. Germany's natural beauty remained largely intact. The countryside had escaped most bombing. Aromatic pine forests stretched for miles. Quaint villages looked like fairy tale illustrations. But the people living in this picturesque landscape were hollow-eyed and thin. Their clothes hung loose on diminished frames. Sharing rations became a form of unintended diplomacy. American soldiers offering chocolate to German children bridged gaps between nations that had been locked in mortal combat just months earlier. When they shared coffee with elderly German civilians, they began processes of reconciliation. These small acts of humanity would eventually transform Germany from enemy to ally. Dr. Margaret Smithson was a Red Cross worker who arrived in Germany during summer 1945. She documented numerous instances of American soldiers going against orders to help German civilians. She recorded cases of GIs leaving open rations where German families could find them. Some pretended to accidentally drop chocolate bars near groups of children. Others claimed rations had been damaged and needed discarding when German civilians were present. The psychological impact on German civilians was profound. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as materialistic and culturally inferior. Yet here were young American soldiers, many barely out of their teens. They casually possessed and shared luxuries Germans could barely imagine. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could a supposedly inferior culture produce such abundance? How could the self-proclaimed master race struggle for survival while their enemies lived in prosperity? Maria Hoffman was a teacher from Hamburg. Her memoir described the day an American soldier gave her a can of peaches from his sea ration. She hadn't tasted fruit in over a year. The sweetness was so intense she initially thought something was wrong with her taste buds. She saved half the can for her children. They stared at the yellow fruit as if it were from another planet. Medical implications were also significant. German civilians who suddenly consumed American rations often became sick from the food's richness. Their bodies had adapted to ersatz coffee, thin soup and bread made with sawdust. They couldn't initially handle chocolate, canned meat, or real coffee. American medics soon learned to warn German civilians to eat small amounts slowly. This advice seemed surreal to people who had been hungry for years. Cigarettes included in American rations were particularly valuable currency. In post-war Germany, cigarettes became more valuable than money in many transactions. A single pack of American cigarettes could buy groceries for a week. They could secure services that no amount of German currency could obtain. When American soldiers shared cigarettes, they were essentially giving away small fortunes. Though many were unaware of this at the time, sharing rations also revealed the sophistication of American military logistics. German civilians were amazed not just by the quantity and quality of American food. They were impressed by the engineering and planning that made it possible. The waterproof packaging impressed them. Can openers attached to every ration seemed like luxury. The careful nutritional balance demonstrated thoughtfulness. The inclusion of comfort items like gum and cigarettes showed attention to morale. All of this demonstrated industrial capability that Germany had never matched, not even at its wartime peak. Young Germans were particularly affected by encounters with American rations. Hans Smula was 14 when Americans arrived in his Bavarian village. He later recalled that seeing American soldiers eat chocolate for breakfast fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. He had been raised to believe in German superiority, yet here were enemy soldiers who lived better than German officers. The psychological impact lasted his entire life. Individual American soldiers' generosity often created bonds that transcended official government policies. Families helped by American GIs often became lifelong supporters of America and democracy. Children who received chocolate from American soldiers grew up with positive associations. These associations persisted through the Cold War and beyond. Word spread through German communities about American abundance. It created complex mixtures of gratitude, resentment, and wonder. Some Germans felt humiliated by their dependence on former enemies' charity. Others were simply grateful for any help in surviving the immediate post-war crisis. But almost all were profoundly shocked by the gap between American abundance and their own deprivation. Sharing rations was just the beginning of a larger story. It was about food, power, and reconciliation in occupied Germany. What started as small acts of individual kindness would eventually evolve into massive relief efforts. These efforts would help feed millions of Germans through the crisis years of the late 1940s. But those early moments in 1945 marked the beginning of transformation. Individual American soldiers first offered their rations to hungry German civilians. This began reshaping both nations and the relationship between them. The shock German civilians felt at American abundance wasn't just about food. It was about realization that they had been living in a bubble of propaganda and deprivation. Meanwhile, their enemies enjoyed standards of living that seemed almost fantastical. This revelation would prove to be one of the most powerful forces in Germany's post-war transformation, from totalitarian enemy to democratic ally. By winter 1945, Isolated acts of compassion were evolving into a humanitarian crisis. This would test America's conscience and reshape its foreign policy. The individual soldier sharing his chocolate bar had become symbolic of a much larger question. What responsibility did victors have toward the vanquished? The situation in Germany was becoming desperate. Stockpiles that the Nazi government had accumulated during the war were running out. German civilians faced what many historians now recognize as near-famine conditions. Allied planners had underestimated both the extent of damage to German infrastructure and the sheer number of people they would need to feed. Instead of the expected 3 million German soldiers surrendering to Western forces, over 5 million had crossed the Elbe River to escape the Soviets. Similarly, 13 million German civilians had fled westward, far more than anticipated. The mathematics of hunger was stark and unforgiving. German agricultural production was devastated by bombing. Foreign workers who had been forced to work German farms were gone. Poor weather made matters worse. Output was sufficient to provide city residents with only 1,000 calories per day. This was what nutritionists recognized as slow starvation level. Without access to additional food sources, recipients would eventually succumb to malnutrition-related diseases. American soldiers on the ground witnessed effects firsthand. Corporal James Mitchell of the 1st Infantry Division wrote to his family describing German children with swollen bellies and stick-thin arms. Classic signs of malnutrition were everywhere. He found it increasingly difficult to open his K-rations in front of these children without sharing. His letters home helped fuel growing debate in America about the moral implications of the non-fraternization policy. The contrast between American and German food situations couldn't have been more dramatic. German civilians survived on watery soup made from turnips. Bread containing sawdust was their staple. Meanwhile, American soldiers were often throwing away portions of their rations. C rations contained multiple canned meats, vegetables, fruits, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. A single American B unit contained calorie-dense crackers, sugar tablets, energy tablets, beverage mixes. Together, these provided more nutrition than many Germans received in several days. The abundance was almost incomprehensible to German civilians. Elizabeth Kruger was a mother of 3 from Cologne. She later recounted watching American soldiers prepare their meals. She thought she was witnessing some kind of elaborate theater. Surely, she thought, no army could routinely feed its soldiers meat, vegetables, chocolate, and coffee all in a single meal. The reality that this was standard fare for American troops challenged everything she had been told about American society. Even more shocking to Germans was the casual waste. American GIs would often discard cigarettes after a few puffs. They threw away coffee that had gotten cold. They left opened rations unfinished. One German civilian watched from his window. He counted 17 cigarettes thrown into the street by American soldiers in a single afternoon. Those 17 cigarettes represented more wealth than he had seen in months. The first organized challenges to the non-fraternization policy came from unexpected sources. American military wives. When wives of American officers began arriving in Germany in late 1945 and early 1946, they received explicit instructions. They were not to allow their German household staff to access leftover food. The regulations stated that food should be destroyed or made inedible rather than shared. But many American women found these orders as difficult to follow as their husbands had found the original non-fraternization rules. Dorothy B.B. was the wife of Brigadier General Louis B.B. in Würzburg. She became one of the most notable examples of humanitarian defiance. She was horrified by conditions of displaced persons living in camps around the ruined city. She openly used her husband's military resources to provide relief. She mobilized other officers' wives. She established connections with relief organizations back home. Mrs. B.B.'s actions represented growing recognition that the post-war situation required more than military occupation. It demanded humanitarian intervention. Her efforts helped establish what would become known as adoption programs. American communities would partner with German cities to provide aid. Her hometown of Faribault, Minnesota, became one of the first to adopt a German city. They sent care packages and supplies directly to Würzburg. The breakthrough in official policy came from an unexpected source: American intelligence reports. In late 1945, a U.S. intelligence survey recorded a German university professor's observation. This observation created ripples throughout the American command structure. The professor reportedly said that American soldiers were good-natured and served as excellent ambassadors. But they created unnecessary ill will by pouring 20 liters of coffee down drains while German civilians watched from nearby windows. This intelligence report highlighted a critical failure in American policy. The non-fraternization rules designed to maintain discipline and avoid the appearance of coddling former enemies were actually undermining American objectives. They created resentment and highlighted the arbitrary nature of American abundance in the face of German suffering. General Lucius Clay served as U.S. military governor in Germany. He began warning officials in Washington about dangerous implications of allowing hunger to persist. In one of his most influential cables, he wrote that there was no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. He argued that their proposed ration allowance would not only defeat American objectives in Europe, but would pave the road to a communist Germany. Clay's warnings were prescient. Soviet propaganda was already exploiting the food situation. They portrayed American policies as deliberately calculated to weaken and destroy the German people. Radio broadcasts from the Soviet sector highlighted instances of American soldiers eating lavishly while German children starved nearby. The Soviets understood that hungry people were more susceptible to revolutionary ideology than well-fed ones. The turning point came in early 1946 when President Harry Truman authorized a comprehensive survey of conditions in occupied Germany. Representatives of 7 American relief organizations were permitted to inspect the situation firsthand. Their final report was devastating in its criticism of existing policies. They documented widespread malnutrition, particularly among children, university students, and elderly people. They noted an increase in deaths from diseases related to poor nutrition. The survey found that while direct starvation deaths remained relatively rare, malnutrition was creating a host of secondary health problems that were killing Germans indirectly. People were dying from diseases they would normally have survived if they had been properly nourished. The investigators concluded that current policies were not just inhumane. They were actively undermining American strategic objectives in Europe. Secretary of War Robert Patterson became one of the strongest advocates for policy change. He warned that outright famine in Germany would be a damaging blow to American foreign policy, not to mention considerations of humanity and the unfavorable reaction among Americans themselves. The moral dimension was becoming as important as the strategic one. The first major policy shift came on February 19, 1946. President Truman approved the creation of the Council of Relief Agencies, licensed for operation in Germany, known by its acronym KRALOG. This umbrella organization was authorized to coordinate the shipment and distribution of food aid to German civilians. For the first time since the war's end, American policy officially acknowledged the humanitarian crisis in occupied Germany. Krylog worked closely with the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe, better known as CARE. This organization had been established in late 1945 to facilitate package services between Americans and Europeans in need. The first CARE packages arrived in France in 1946, but Germany soon became the most popular destination for these humanitarian shipments. The contents of CARE packages seemed designed to address exactly the shortages German civilians faced most acutely. The first packages assembled from surplus military rations included canned meat, fruits, vegetables, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. These were items that had been luxuries in American military rations, but they had become unimaginable treasures to German civilians. Americans responded to the CARE program with remarkable generosity. For $10, equivalent to about $143 today, an American could send a CARE package to a German family. The program became so popular that CARE was soon flooded with purchases. Many were addressed simply to a hungry family in Germany, or a hungry occupant of a bombed cottage. CARE promised to deliver all packages within 4 months, even without specific addresses. The psychological impact of receiving a CARE package was often as important as the nutritional value. German families would carefully save the cardboard boxes. They used them for storage, or even as kindling. The return address labels became treasured connections to the outside world. Many German families began corresponding with their American benefactors. Relationships often lasted for decades, but perhaps the most significant change came in daily interactions between American soldiers and German civilians. As official policies relaxed, informal sharing of rations became more open and systematic. American mess halls began setting aside leftover food for distribution to German civilians. Soldiers were encouraged to interact with German children as part of denazification efforts. The Berlin airlift of 1948 and 1949 represented the culmination of this evolution from enemy to ally. When the Soviets blockaded Berlin, American pilots not only delivered essential supplies, they also dropped candy and chocolate to German children using tiny parachutes. The candy bomber flights became symbols of American generosity. They helped cement German loyalty to the Western Allies. Lieutenant Gale Halverson became known as the original candy bomber. He started the practice almost by accident. After giving some German children his chewing gum and seeing their grateful reaction, he promised to drop more candy the next day. Word spread throughout Berlin. Soon, American pilots were coordinating massive candy drops. They delivered hundreds of pounds of chocolate and sweets to German children each week. The impact of these gestures extended far beyond their material value. German children who had been taught to fear and hate Americans were instead receiving gifts from the sky. The psychological transformation was profound and lasting. Many of these children grew up to become strong supporters of democracy and Atlantic partnership. By 1948, the transformation was complete. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal told a Denver audience that the current German adult ration of 1425 calories was equivalent to little more than a hearty American breakfast. This frank acknowledgement of the disparity marked how far American policy had evolved from the strict non-fraternization orders of 1945. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 and extended to West Germany in 1949, formalized America's commitment to German recovery. This massive program of economic and technical assistance was built on the foundation of individual acts of kindness that had begun with soldiers sharing their rations. The candy bars and coffee that American GIs had given to German children had evolved into a comprehensive program of national reconstruction. The long-term consequences of these early food-sharing experiences were profound. Germans who had been helped by American soldiers or received care packages often became lifelong supporters of democratic values and Atlantic Partnership. The generation of German children who had received chocolate from American soldiers grew up to build one of Europe's strongest democracies and most reliable American allies. The story of American soldiers sharing their rations with German civilians reveals something fundamental about the nature of reconciliation and reconstruction after conflict. It demonstrates that policy changes often begin with individual acts of humanity that challenge official directives. The soldier who handed chocolate to a hungry German child was doing more than filling an empty stomach. He was building the foundation for a new relationship between former enemies. The shock that German civilians experienced when they first encountered American abundance was more than simple amazement at the quantity and quality of American rations. It was the shock of recognition that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally wrong. They had been told that Americans were culturally and materially inferior. Yet here was evidence of a society so prosperous that it could casually waste what Germans treasured as luxuries. This realization opened German minds to other possibilities. If Nazi propaganda had been wrong about American material poverty, what else might have been false? The chocolate bar became a crack in the wall of totalitarian thinking. It allowed democratic ideas to seep through. Food became a form of soft power more effective than any military occupation could achieve. The transformation of Germany from enemy to ally is often attributed to grand strategic decisions and massive economic programs, but it began with individual American soldiers who couldn't bring themselves to eat chocolate in front of hungry children. Their simple acts of human kindness created the emotional foundation upon which larger policies could be built. Today, as we face new challenges in international relations and post-conflict reconstruction, the story of American soldiers sharing their rations with German civilians offers important lessons. It reminds us that reconciliation often begins not with official policies, but with individual acts of compassion. It demonstrates that abundance shared generously can be more powerful than abundance hoarded selfishly. The 8-year-old German girl who cried when she first tasted American chocolate grew up in a democratic Germany that became one of America's closest allies. The shock she felt that day in 1945 was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not just Germany, but the entire world order. Sometimes the most profound changes in history begin with the simplest human gestures. A soldier offering his ration to a hungry child. Enemy to enemy. Human to human.